Formula One is one of the most dangerous sports in the world. Unfortunately, sometimes things go really wrong, and drivers die on the racetrack. Which driver came in second in the championship even after his death? And which driver switched to Formula One because it was safer than his previous job? Stay tuned as we count down the worst deaths in Formula One history. First up, Riccardo Paletti. Riccardo Paletti was a racing driver from Italy. His career in Formula One was short and tragic, and we never got to see his potential. Unfortunately, his story is one of a lack of experience in entering Formula One too early. He had only been racing professionally for 3 years before joining the Osella Formula One team. He had admitted that he had a lot to learn and that he was hesitant to drive in the fastest motorsport in the world, but was still motivated to compete. It was the 1982 season and Paletti had failed to qualify for 4 of the 8 races he entered. He also had a few problems with his car, but the main issue was his lack of pace. At times, he was around 2 seconds slower than his teammate. Then, at the Canadian Grand Prix, it was the first time that Paletti had successfully qualified and would be starting from the grid. But up ahead of him, Didier Pironi stalled his Ferrari and was stationary on the grid. Most drivers reacted and were able to swerve around the car and crash straight into the back of Didier at around 180 kilometers per hour. Paletti was left unconscious between a crushed steering wheel and the back of his seat and needed the urgent attention of medical staff. But when the FIA's doctor Sid Watkins arrived at the scene, the car ignited into a fireball and he had jumped out of the way. The fire was eventually put out, but it then took 25 minutes to cut him loose from the wreckage. Once he arrived at the hospital by helicopter, he was already dead. Next we have Gilles Villeneuve. If you're a Formula One fan, then you'll recognize this man's name as the circuit where the Canadian Grand Prix takes place. Gilles Villeneuve was a Canadian racing driver who raced in F1 throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Villeneuve drove for Ferrari after Niki Lauda left the team in 1977. In 1979, he came second in the Drivers' World Championship to Jody Scheckter by just 4 points. Then at the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix, tragedy hit Villeneuve. It was during a qualifying session and he was trying to improve his time. He came over a hilly section of the circuit where driver Jochen Mass was driving quite slowly. Mass tried to move out of the way, but Villeneuve tried to overtake him in the same direction and slammed into the back of the car. Like something out of a movie, Villeneuve's car went flying into the air at 200 kilometers per hour before crashing down onto the ground. His body went flying out of the car and landed next to a fence, motionless. A number of drivers stopped to try and help him, but when the doctor arrived, there wasn't much they could do. He was taken by helicopter to a nearby hospital and kept on life support, but he died later that night. His son Jacques was 11 at the time, grew up to be a racing driver too, but not just any racing driver. He won the 1997 Formula One World Championship. His father would be so proud. And now we have Gary Hocking. This man was most famous for motorcycle racing, not car racing. Gary Hocking was a South African motorcycle racer who began his racing career in Europe in the late 1950s. Before long, he was offered a drive with the team MV Agusta. In 1961, he won the World Championship over defending champion John Surtees. But the next year, his good friend Tom Phillips died in the infamous Isle of Man Tourist Trophy race that races motorbikes throughout public roads in one of the most dangerous courses in the world. Hocking was deeply affected by this and chose to retire from motorcycle racing as a result. He chose to instead race in motorcar racing because he thought that it would be safer. Tragically, the very next year, in 1962, Gary Hocking was killed at the Natal Grand Prix in South Africa. It was during a practice and his car flipped after he ran off the track. Hocking was just 25 years old and was trying to take care of himself while doing what he loves. Which driver was so good that he finished second in the championship even after his death? And how did the legendary driver Ayrton Senna die? Don't go anywhere to find out. Next is Jules Bianchi. Next up is the most recent death on the list. Jules Bianchi was a young French racing driver on track to be driving for Ferrari. He was part of the Ferrari Driver Academy and in 2014 was competing with Marussia F1. Late in the season, he was driving at the Japanese Grand Prix and battling heavy rain. On lap 42, Sauber driver Adrian Stuhl had crashed his car at turn 7 into the barriers. As a safety precaution, a crane was sent out to remove his car from the track, but the very next lap, Bianchi also lost control of his car at the same corner and crashed into the crane. The crane impacted heavily into Bianchi's head at a speed of over 200 kilometers per hour. He was unresponsive to team radio after the incident and was taken quickly by ambulance straight to the hospital. Because of the dangerous conditions, a helicopter evacuation was not possible. At the hospital, he was treated by intensive care doctors and his condition was stabilized after emergency surgery. Bianchi never improved and 9 months later, he died from his injuries. Bianchi was the godfather of current Ferrari driver Charles Leclerc, and he said in 2018 that he would try to win the titles that Jules Bianchi deserved. As of 2022, it looks like Charles might just do that. And then we have Ayrton Senna. If you asked people 10 years ago who they associated Formula One with, it would be Michael Schumacher. But if you go back another 10 years, it was Ayrton Senna. The young Brazilian was a prodigy in junior racing. He won Formula Ford 1600, Formula Ford 2000, and the British Formula 3. He couldn't be stopped and he sailed through to Formula One. When he made his debut with Team Lotus, he was an instant hit. In just his second race of the 1985 Portuguese Grand Prix, he took pole position and lapped almost every driver on the track during the race. From this moment, it was clear to everyone that he was an exciting young driver to watch. Senna went on to win 3 world championships and fought bitterly with his biggest rival, Alain Prost. Many people consider him to be the greatest racing driver of all time. He raced with Lotus and McLaren before signing with Williams in 1994 for a reported $20 million. But that season would be his last. At the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix in Italy, Senna was involved in a high-speed crash. On lap 7 of the race, just after racing had gotten started again following a safety car, Senna's Williams car drifted straight off the track and slammed into a concrete barrier at over 200 kilometers per hour. Straight away, it was clear that Senna would be seriously injured. Different parts of the car had snapped off and knocked into his helmet, including the suspension, a wheel, and parts of the wall. He was treated by medical professionals at the scene to stabilize his condition. He was taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital, where he remained on life support for a few hours before his heart stopped again and he died. An investigation into the crash found that it was a mechanical failure that was the cause of the crash. Back in Brazil, 3 days of national mourning were held by the government to honor him. Up next, Ronnie Peterson. This man was nicknamed the Super Swede and is widely regarded as one of the best drivers of the 1970s. Peterson raced with the March Racing Team, where he came runner-up in the 1971 season to Jackie Stewart. He then drove with Lotus, where he came in 3rd place in 1973. In 1978, in the third last race, on the opening lap, there was a big collision involving 10 different cars. One of them was Peterson's, and his car went flying into the barriers. It burst into flames upon impact, and Marshall ran into the car to try and put it out. While they were doing that, other drivers, including James Hunt, had managed to lift Peterson out of his car. Just after the incident, it seemed like he was okay. He had injured his legs pretty badly, but he was conscious and was taken to the hospital for surgery. After operating on him, Peterson got sicker, and by the next morning, he had full kidney failure. At just after 9 o'clock that morning, he was declared dead. That year, with only 2 more races to go, Peterson still finished second in the Drivers' Championship. He was a true racing driver even after his death. This just reminds us how dangerous Formula One is. All of the drivers on the grid risk their lives to do what they love. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.